This tutorial will cover how to create a broken concrete surface. We're looking at like a base concrete or base dirty concrete material here, which has some dips and cavities in here that are either man-made, like created destruction through impact, or maybe just through erosion or general use. We will cover like the complete workflow from high to normal to color pass, and you can see like I split all the different passes into subtitles and frames so you can understand what I did at which time. And we're going to naturally start off with the base concrete surface, which makes up our very, very initial height that we want to work with. So to start off, I'm using a black and white spots 2 node, which is set to a scale of 4. So I get like more resolution to work with, because increasing the scale here gives me the, let's say, correct size of the spots that I want to have on the surface, because this is set to a 2 by 2 meter surface. So I need to respect the size here at the very beginning. And also a dirt 3, which is also set to the scale of 4. And you can see these spots here are kind of like the same size, but different in a way. And we're going to make use of a blend node, which is really just set to copy and 0.5. So we naturally mix both together with the same intensity without affecting the grayscale values as such, because we just want to have both in there. And this gives us a very good, like, noisy type variation right off the start. This is going to be sent through an auto levels node. You can see we reintroduce a little bit of the range that is lost on the way. And this is just to make sure that we are like covering the whole range as such, because we're going to work with very, very low grayscale values, or let's say uniform or even grayscale values. So it's hard to see what we're actually doing here. And we need to like preview this with a different node. So now comes like the very, very baseline of our material. And you can see I'm using a levels node here, which has like the upper values crunched to barely the range where our grayscale values are sitting in. And also the low values are really, really tied together. And what this does, if we are looking at the information here on the right, you can see here the value information. If I'm hovering my mouse over these pixels, they're barely over like 60, 61, or around like 58 to 61 maximum. And these are very, very narrow height values, but they're still apparent. So the information we had here before is still there. And we can drive normal information from that. Let me just show you here in a second. Even with an intensity of 1, you can already see the noise here. Let me just increase this real quick. So there is a lot of noise happening, but for our height values, we want to have a certain baseline that is both even in values, because the displacement on this material is not really affecting our base concrete too much, just ever so slightly, not too much. And we also want to make sure, because we're normally starting from a height level value of 0.5, so the shader evaluates a neutral baseline of, let's say, a value of 0.5 here as neutral, which is not affected by displacement. Right now, we're like on 60 just because we want to make sure that the values we had before here are evened out in their range. But later on, you can see here, like the nodes get brighter. We are moving at a value of close to 0.5 because we do not want to have the displacement of the concrete be affected as a whole downwards or upwards. It should be close to a neutral baseline once we start displacing, which is why we're tightening the values here.
And we are doing this to already put the height map in the a correct range for us. Preferably, we would try to aim for a value that's around 0.5 or 128, because we don't want the actual concrete material to sink down when we are displacing with a base median of 0.5, which is usually what the displacement tab is expecting or marmoset. I can show you here. if you go into the materials and displacement tab, you could see a height level slider here, which is set to 0.5. This evaluates all height values to be 0 or neutral as long as they are on 0.5 or 128. So with this number here, we would actually displace it down already if we were not adding anything else besides that. But of course, we'll work on this. So in the next move, I'm using a blend node here together with a grunge concrete node. This is a base node. You can find that like by using the search tab here, just a grunge concrete. And I'm blending it over with a copy again and with a very low opacity. We will blend a lot of stuff with very low opacity here. And that's for a reason, because everything we add, we don't want to like have too much impact on the surface overall. Okay, so moving on, I'm just grabbing my output here with a transform 2D node. And honestly, looking at this values here, I don't remember exactly what I did here. So I'm just going to use this plugin here, which I'm going to link in the README as well, which automatically just notes all the changes that were made here within the node that I specified before. So what I did here probably was just rotate it, which makes sense when I look at what's coming next, because I'm using a screen blend node after this one here. So basically I'm using all the fine noise values that I have here, like flip them around 100 degrees, 180 degrees, and 90 degrees, and just blend them over with the screen value. Right. So if you're looking at this now and inspecting it, you could see that we are close to 0.5 here. If we were really precise, we would now use a levels node after this and actually push these values back to 0.5. But I want to make sure that I do this at the end, because right now all I'm caring about is having a correct baseline overall and being able to detect certain changes and values I put into the sitemap afterwards. So now we're coming to the first custom node that you would have to buy yourself if you wanted to open the graph and like make changes and adjustments and export the textures yourself, because this will be shown as a ghost instance for you if you do not have this node. There would be other options to like native nodes you could use here instead of the DTLO passing. Also, all the nodes that I'm using here will also be linked in the README. So if you want to have them yourself, or if you already process them and want to link them in order to use the graph, I will show you so. But yeah, so the DTLO passing is in general just like really evening out the surface here for me, because all I want to do is get rid of some high frequency here. Actually, there is a node that can visualize this probably. If I'm using the histogram equalize here, we are getting like it's working like an auto levels, but more in our favor to actually display things right now. And you could see when I'm changing these off that every value is slightly getting softer here. So we have a really uniform distributed noise, and with the low pass filter, it's like more centralized towards certain points. And even though you can barely notice this here in this node, because we have very few ranges to work with in this grayscale, it's still happening, which is why I'm showing you this with the histogram equalize node. I'm actually going to carry this around a bit more to like show you at certain examples why something is working, even though you can barely see it here. Yeah, and for the next, I'm just plugging in a histogram range node. You can see I'm not changing these values here. This is purely for adjusting later on. As I said, if I need this to be higher values, like actually be around 0.5 here, I could just use the range node here and like increase the position. And you could see like the values are now close to 0.5, which is just like a post-processing even early on, but it does the trick. So this is my base concrete surface. Let's see, I'm also going to create a new base material node here. So I can plug in some things on the way as we work to show off what I'm doing here. Let's see, normal and completely rough, and also a bit lighter. And now I'm picking a normal node and increasing the values quite a bit. Plug this in here and view in 3D. So as you can see, all I did here was very high frequent noise, nothing too special, but it gives a general good baseline. And you can see, like, even though it's highly noisy, we have some localized clusters where the noise is very flattened in comparison to the other one. And this is some essential detailing that you have to do to really push the realism. And in this stage, I just make sure it's already in there early on, even though I might have to introduce it later, depending on how much details I'm going to add. But I want to make sure that at every layer and at every step I work, I have the correct details available that I would need later on. So yeah, I'm just going to grab these nodes here and move them alongside so we can like keep on working and visualizing things. So now my first surface noise pass comes in, and this is generally the type of workflow I like to do the most. I'm basically adding layers over layers over layers. And the usual approach is always from macro to micro shapes, which is just the natural flow of creating things, because you want to go from big details to small details. Otherwise, you would overwrite them and also probably not embed them correctly. But I also like to bring this a step further, and for the details I'm working on, I like to introduce layers, which means that even though I could like incorporate more details early on, I want to split this into several passes and make sure they add up on top of each other, even though they're contributing to essentially the same thing I want to show off. This will make sense in a second, so let me just move you through this. So the first thing I'm going to do is to use a non-uniform blur with a grunge plaster painted node. You might not have this. Again, it's a node from Adobe that's for some reason not incorporated into the native nodes, but they're free to download. Again, the link is in the README. I'm blurring this very slightly, like ever so slightly, just to make sure there's no very high crunch in here. You can barely see the difference. Actually, if I look at this, I could barely spot it as well. Maybe it's just like a usual thing for me to do, that in order to use the blur grayscale, I usually use a blurred input as well. But yeah, what this does is to blur some areas. As you can see, this is like the typical non-uniform blur filter applied. And all I want to do is cut off more of this high frequency noise that is still available in the material. Right. And in the next move, there's going to be a blending of a black and white spots 2 node. Again, I'm using a scale of 2 here, making it a little bit smaller, but not so small as in the beginning where I'm using a scale of 4. I'm leveling it a bit just to like separate some values and not be too uniform with what I blend in. And as you can see, I'm subtracting these values here with a very, very low opacity. Like I said, we are going to work towards a very flat surface overall. So everything we end up doing to the height needs to make sure that it's not exaggerating all the values and shapes into like really weird and big dimensions, because most of the lifting is going to do our normal later on, and we can increase this like the intensity naturally with this slider here. Like I can increase the detail and the crispiness I need to with just one slider. But if the height map already has too much range in values, this is going to be falsely applied later into the material, which can be a little bit tricky to work with, because again, you could barely see what changes here. It looks like completely gray surface. But this is why we're using the equalize node here to visualize what we're actually doing. So yeah, I applied the blur here. And the next step, I'm going to subtract some values. And you can see like this is adding way more than it actually is adding. But you can see that my mask, basically as it is here, is going to be subtracted from the baseline here. And what that does is, if we're going to have a look at the normal again, I need to reduce this back to a range that's actually quite usable. Yeah, 20 is fine. So I'm going to take the non-uniform blur, and you can see like it's really blurred now. There is a lot of way too flat areas here on the surface. And by subtracting fine noise again back from this, now also on the blurred areas, you could see that we now get like a really uneven and also different in scale of this very soft spots here that are all carved into the surface. While we still have this localized clusters which have a tendency to be quite smooth. And with this scheme, we're going to work a lot throughout this material. So let me quickly show you what I'm doing up here. Why is this in the first surface noise pass? So yeah, I'm using my blurred version here, or not blurred version of the noise back here as a mask input. And for the tile sample here, I'm using a amount of 100 by 100 and a bell pattern. Also make sure there's a lot of randomness going on, both in scale, in rotation and position, of course, just to have this like anywhere. And my mask map threshold basically just cuts off a lot of values. As you can see here, I'm just trying to be quite localized with what I'm applying here. Next up, we have the slope blur grayscale HD node. And what this does is like we need to really zoom in to see this, but we have like this uniform values here, and now we're chopping away some with the mode set to min and a low intensity and a lot of samples, which is why we're using the HD version, because the HD version actually makes it so that you can slope blur with sharp edges. The regular node only has like up to 64 samples, I think, and that's not enough to really get this slope that you want to have sometimes in your material. Generally, I'm just using a Clouds 2 for this, and moving on, I'm plugging my slope version of this into my input, and my intensity and warp map will also be the Clouds 2 node. Just recycling it because we just need any noise here. And you can see it's only like nudging these values just a bit, very uniform, very non-uniformly. In the next step, I'm going to apply a sharpen. Again, you can barely see it. It's just the thing that you will notice once I plug this into the normal map later on. So I always recommend when you're working with surfaces like this, make sure you have a normal setup early on so you can actually visualize what you're doing. So let me just plug this in here. Maybe we can see something. Yeah. So these are my normal values. And now that I sharpen them, you can see they actually get a little bit crispy on the outer skirts here. Next up, I'm going to use a blend node set to subtract with a mask that we have not yet talked about. I will do so in a second because it comes from up here, and this is the mask to actually localize our concrete damage. So I'm going to apply this material once again here. This might take a second. Yeah, but we have these dips here, as we talked before. We have these dips where the concrete is like broken and the underlying stone is shown. And we need to make sure that we want to avoid having the same detail in these dips as on the surface, which is why on several occasions on this material, I'm actually using a mask driven from up here, which we will talk about again in a second, and make sure that I subtract this from my actual shapes. So just to make sure I have these dots here, and I'm subtracting my mask. And you can see like in the center here, a few dots just disappear. Nothing too crazy, but just so you know why we have a blend here. Next up, I'm going to, again, non-uniform directional warp them. Just crank all the sliders up here and increase the intensity. This will essentially just warp them against themselves, like pinch them. You can see like there's this edge here appearing while this was the default. And this is my setting. And for the last part, just to distort them even more, a multi-directional warp grayscale set to average 4 directions and a low intensity. And all I'm trying to do is break up the details that I'm going to implement here more and more over the course, because we want to break the uniformity. We started off with bass noises that we didn't even warp or affect too much. But we need to move on from this because it's very noticeable. So every detail I'm going to add here is highly distorted and slope blurred, just for the sake of adding realism. And just to have a look, what's the difference here? Again, this is our equalize node. And now I'm going to plug like all the things I did here into the last blend node, again, subtracting the values because I just want the surface to be like pushed in more. And actually on 2K, you could barely even see these details. But yeah, we can like see them on the normal map. So let's see what's the difference here. Okay, it's again barely noticeable, but have a look at this area here. Now, once I subtract all metal dense, you can see there are a lot of holes coming in here. And these are again different in size and also shape to what we had before here. So we're adding another layer of actually the same effect that we had before, but with a different approach. And if we're looking at the normal map here, I'm just going to preview this again. This was before, and this is after. You could barely see a difference. Actually, here are some dents. It's probably even more noticeable if I'm showing it like this. These are disappearing and now they're coming back. But they're doing the same thing. Actually, they're doing the same thing. And looking at our second surface pass, you can see here that I called them outer bumps. I actually should have called them inner bumps here, but now we're going to add some details on top of the surface, so actually pushing outwards. I will already spoil that the last blend node, so the actual only blend or addition I do here is going to be set to screen with a low opacity. So we're adding details back on top. And you can see I'm not using a mask here, so I'm also implying that all the details I'm going to add here on top, pushing outwards of the surface, are also applied on the noise we already have implemented here, which again layers on top of the same effect. So how did I do this? I'm using a grunge plaster correct node, which again is one of Adobe's somewhere hidden nodes that are going to be linked. And I am again using a slope blur grayscale HD set to blur with a low intensity and use the same input here. And what this does is basically just tightens the values altogether. Like they're going to be pushed together, and I eliminate a lot of the fine cracks here that I do not want to have. Next up, I'm going to level those, just decreasing the white values back to a median point. And you can see again here on the values that we are moving towards 0.5. So I want to have all the details that I do not want to incorporate at a very base level. And next up, we're going to use an as splatter node. Again, this is a custom node that's going to be linked. But what it does is it just simplifies what I would do with a regular tile sampler otherwise, because it's just taking my input and it's splitting it all over. So we're talking about random position, random rotation, random scale, number of inputs, and this is all just simplified with a very easy to access node here. So if you do not want to get this node, just use a tile sampler. It does the same trick. And I'm basically just splatting this shape over itself over and over. And you can see here that we have some hard cuts naturally. It does tile, of course, but if we just use this input and like turn it around, we would see these corners repeating. So the splatter cannot take care of this, and it's fine because I actually want to have these hard cuts in here. Next up, we're going to level this, and you can see these hard cuts back again in here. Again, we're not afraid of them at all. And as you can see here, for the values, I inverted them. So I took the white values from the right side and pushed them over, and also just crunched them a bit to eliminate some spots. Next up, we're going to use a non-uniform directional warp with all inputs set to the same, low intensity, but all sliders correct. And this is, again, just messing with the values and adding some more crunchy noise that we want. Next up, we have a non-uniform blur grayscale, which uses the actual cracked plaster. Oh, is it correct? Yeah, cracked plaster as input. So we're just smoothing out like really randomly varies. I'm not specifically thinking about too much what I want to incorporate here, but it's sure that I want to add another detail of outer bumps. So I need to have a localized area to where to apply those, and also some very fine and sharp noise. Next up, we're also going to non-uniform directional warp again. You can see, again, all the sliders are set to the maximum value, trailer to max and low intensity. Now we have a multi-directional warp grayscale. And now comes the fun part, because we are doing this and set this to 4-direction average, we are basically ripping all values we created before apart and introduce this really choppy noise. Like crystallized, you could say. And you can also see like the tiling issues that we had before are not present anymore, so we didn't even bother. Next up, I'm going to use a transform node, and let me see what I did here. I increased the size by 2 times because now I'm breaking the tiling, but I want to have these crystallized details bigger. And I'm going to add a make it photo grayscale node after to introduce tiling back again. I usually go with very low precision values here because it just makes a smoother blend, but in general, you have to experiment with these values. There is no real answer on how to do that. I just want to fix the tiling and not make it obvious at certain spots. So I'm going to screen this over, and again, you cannot see any major difference. But this is where the nodes come in handy, because this is the surface we had before, and this is the surface we have after. And you can see like these bumps are quite big in comparison, but they still incorporate the noise that we have from down below. Let's see how this looks in the equalize node, just for the sake of continuity. Yeah, so we are basically just shifting values around and introducing more noise. Basically just introducing more noise. Okay, and now we have the first detail surface pass. What that means is that we are now moving away from the layering that I had here, like first surface noise pass, second surface noise pass, and now we are back to first pass of something. And we're adding small bumps, but now they should better respect what we did already. Even though it's still a surface pass, so I like to work in the layering method and it's still applied to some degree, but we're now adding a different detail on top. And what I did here is grab again a black and white spots node 2, this time set to the scale 3. Again, I like to recycle nodes, but I somehow needed them to be at a different scale and not repeat, so I had to use multiple of these, which can increase timings. So depending on where you need that, it's quite heavy to compute. Right. So I plugged this into a transform 2D node, and you could see like I turned this 45 degrees and stretch it out a lot to get this directional noise here. I'm using a histogram select next to select only ever so slight details. If you're going into the equalize node, it's barely visible actually. Next up is a blur HQ grayscale with a low intensity, and again, you're not actually able to see much of the detail. However, this makes sense because we're not wanting to add a lot to it. So it's like a back and forth and value tuning. You just have to experiment with this. I'm actually going to plug this into the normal node to see what's happening here. So yeah, we have like 3 dots. In theory, we could also scrap this part at this point. But again, I'm just adding for hyperrealism, so I want to have every single bit of detail that I'm interested in. Okay, so we have this small bumps here, this very small dots, and we're going to plug them into a non-uniform directional warp with these spots again set as an input. And what this does, again, this node is set all the same, again, all values to max. And what this does is basically just carving in this little dot here. So we have this uniformity, you can see here, and just we are carving into them and adding some noise. Next up is a slope blur grayscale, set to min, low intensity, and we are using, let's see, this clouds node here as an input. So you can see here, I'm recycling this all the way over to here, just to crystallize this a bit. Again, showing in the normal inspector. And last but not least, we have a blend node here, which is set to subtract. And again, I'm using the bumps that I already had created beforehand and subtract them from my current iteration. So theoretically, I could go into this and increase the range, which would increase more of these bumps. So this is the point where you can experiment with this. You can see I'm increasing this and there's more bumps appearing. But I want to make sure that the ones that I had already introduced are not going to be evaluated here. So I'm subtracting these. At this point, it's not doing anything in a node per se. But if I were to increase this more, there might be some spots that share the same area. So this is why I eliminate them. So looking at our blend node here, it's set to screen again because we're adding more small bumps to it. And if you look at our normal map, and now with the small bumps introduced, you could see here, they're like very small and very noisy, but even though added on top. And if I go back to my original value, which was I think 0.05, you could still see them, like they're here. They're very small spots, just ever so slightly at some locations, and those add up to the realism. So yeah, for example, this spot right here, no outer bump, 2 outer bumps. It's very slightly, but stick with me, it's going to make sense all the way through. So here we're going to the first damage and imperfection pass. So basically this is all we need for the concrete because we got everything set in place and we got the right noise scale. And now it may look complicated, but actually it's really easy to follow. I'm using portal nodes quite a lot in this graph here just to organize things. And at this particular location, I have like this output is named custom grunge for me because it's just a custom grunge that I'm going to use. And I'm already using the portal here. I could have just moved this cable over there, but I thought it's easier to understand if I'm going to be equally using portals all over where I'm using this custom grunge. So for the damage and imperfection, again, I just want to have certain noise applied to everything I have already. And I'm using another node that you're probably not having, which is the grunge.thin. Again, it's free from Adobe. And I'm going to use 2 passes of the as splatter again, just splattering the same noise over and over itself. And you can see they are like kind of the same, result, which is what I aim for, but there are two different seeds. And for the first grunge, I'm using a clamp grayscale, so I can eliminate a lot of the details and get like a flat baseline of everything that I not want to have incorporated later on. This is going to put through a levels node, so I have only white values and nothing else is applied to the next blend node, because if I had some gray values, this would actually affect the next outcome because I'm using a subtract here. So if I would use this and subtract it from my baseline, this would just go really dark. I can show you. You can see here, this is like adding way too much detail. We can now see it with our bare eyes, which tells me for the surface it's not matching correctly. So I had to use another levels node to eliminate all this gray stuff and put it to black. Yeah, so this is like not even a directed fine noise anymore. It's literally just random grunge spots, maybe even some scratches inside here, maybe even some dust. So I'm not paying particular attention anymore to adding more details because now I want to destroy it and make it dirty. But again, I don't want to have this overall applied to everywhere on the surface as this. So I'm going to use my second grunge I did down here, blur it a bit and level it. So just crunching these values together to eliminate some areas and use it as a mask. And if you look at this results through our normal here, you can see that these spots appear here. And they're ever so non-uniform because they're actually just incorporating the details we had used before. So it's another layer of stuff, but it's not as directional as it's coherent with the material we're working on. So every noise we did so far was aiming towards creating something that looks like concrete. And now we're aiming to destroy it again. Which is why we do not pay attention too much on what details we add, just to have them being random and in the correct scale. All right. So as you know, I like to work in layers. I said this like a million times now. So we have a second pass doing actually the same thing. And for this, I'm starting off with a Crex01 node, which is actually a proprietary node of my old company. But you could actually use whatever you want. It's all about just creating some random noise that we can apply here. You could also use just a regular scratches generator and get the exact same result probably. But I just tend to use custom nodes at all places where I have them. So I'm going to warp this Crex with the cells 4, which actually just like rips them apart. Every time you use a non-uniform directional warp with like really clear cuts or really clear distinct contrasts, it's just going to rip them apart, like slicing through them. And you can see here with the invert grayscale, I actually have something that is similar to a scratches generator. So I noticed that once I had it put it in, and I thought, why not? It works, why not? Again, I'm using a as splatter. Do not bother too much about all the settings in here. You can check them in the graph if you want to. But I'm just going to do anything to make it look random and appealing for me. It's trial and error. Next up, I'm slope blurring those, set to minimum and a lower intensity, which, as you can see, just carves them in a bit and makes them chunky. And also using a non-uniform directional warp with both inputs set to our slope, which again tightens the values, like pushes them onto each other. It stacks them, basically. Now I'm using any grunge map I could find. The grunge map 2 worked well for me. And I'm just subtracting this, just to cut off even more from what I had before, because I thought it's too much. It was too uniform and too heavy on the actual amount of stuff I would add later on. So I just masked some out with some random grunge. Next up, we got a high pass. And what this does is basically giving me all the highlights, like all the crisp edges, all the edges that we introduced from the non-uniform directional warp, and isolate them. So using a levels pass after, we get like really fine, distinct scratches and damage and dents. And again, of course, because I'm introducing scratches, this is going to be subtracted again and not added. And if you look at our surface here on the top, where is it actually? Where is it applied to? Let me see. I didn't spot the difference right now. Okay, it's very slightly. It's very slightly. Yeah, here are some scratches. Like they're super fine. This one here. Of course, we could increase this value if you want to have them more pronounced. As you can see, even higher values like work well on the surface, I would say. But I used like very low values because this is still working towards my height map, and I actually want to have this small scratches appear in my displacement. So I need to be very careful with adding or subtracting values to not disturb the baseline of around 0.5 too much. All right. Even though we added some, you could say, scratches, there's another pass that actually tackles all the surface and the scratches and cracks that I want to introduce in this material. So let me quickly go through this. Yeah, to create some cracks, we start off with a crystal node here, which I increased in scale by quite a lot, like we got 82 here. I'm going to level this, actually inverting the values and also moving the gray more towards the inverted white, so we get like this very soft glow here. And I'm plugging both into a distance node. This is going to be my source input, and this is going to be my mask. You can barely make out that there's something happening, but after using an edge attack, you can see, yeah, we basically get some cell pattern going with a lot of arrows. Actually, these are like rounding arrows, and we get them in here, but this time this is what we actually want. To introduce more variation, I'm plugging this into a transform 2D node, making it a bit smaller and rotating it by 90 degrees. And I'm going to blend it over with a max lighten, which gives us this really fine web here of cables, of edges. Now I'm using another custom node from Daniel Tiger, which is the DT directional warp. You could also just use a regular directional warp. I just felt like I could use this node and try it out for once. So it gave a good result, but you could just use a regular directional warp. I think it wouldn't make too much of a difference. And let me see, plug this to like 30 maybe. Yeah, like you could see it's basically the same. I just tend to use the directional warp here. Moving on, I'm blending some scratches that I generated here. So I increased the spline number to 1000 and made them like really thin and less distorted. So most of them are like really directional. And I just blend them by screen over. You can make them out here. Like it's fine detail, maybe not even noticeable later on, but I felt like they add another good layer of detailing. Next up, I'm going to use a Clouds 2 node. Nothing special, just increasing the scale and multiplying it over this. So we get more different height values in our sketches, because now they're all pure white and I want to have them different intensities. And after that, I'm going to use a slope blur node with our crystals as input. And what you can see is that this introduces, I don't know how to even call this effect, but generally you have some form of extrusion and slope from the cracks towards the cavities. It just looks really cool, and it worked for what I intended to use. So the next step, again, I'm using a high pass to eliminate details that I do not want here, and levels after to make sure that I'm not adding any baseline values in between here, but only the highlights. So we need some more warping of all these values here. So next up, I'm using a directional warp. Just experimented with something that looked warped enough. Actually just offset them a bit to the down right here. Maybe we could just scrap this whole step overall. In the next one, I'm again just multiplying to increase more variety in the height, using just a random crunch map. Didn't think about this too much. And plugging this in another slope blur with a very high scale clouds noise. And yeah, you could see like we're chopping and chopping and chopping layers after layers away of these cracks, and we end up with a lot of different and non-uniform details that are partially directional, partially really curved. We got slopes, we got bumps and flatter areas. We got everything in here that's just random and appears to be something like cracks or damage. At the next step, I'm blurring this and plugging this into a blend node, which screens my input here over the blurred one. And this just gives us this halo effect. So like this is very sharpened, this is very blurry, and this is just a mix of both. It's a good trick to increase some halo and soft outer blurs. And actually, this is going to be my scratches and cracks mask, which I'm going to be using already down here. So it might look a bit confusing, but again, I'm doing this for continuity because I started using these portals at some spots and I felt like I need to use them everywhere now, so it makes sense across the whole material. So after we got all this set up here for our scratches and cracks, I'm now going to blend them over. You could see like there's a pattern here where I do a lot of stuff that introduces a certain detail and one blend node at the end. And this is happening across the whole material, which is very easy to read. So down here, I'm using like another random noise that I got from Adobe. And I'm blending it together with my broken concrete height, which is, again, the mask we didn't talk about yet, but I want to make sure that all the cracks and all the damage I'm introducing is not present in my dips, which is why from the mask, I'm already subtracting it to make sure they're not or barely present in these dips. And now I'm adding this over with, again, a subtract node to make sure that all the detail here is carved into my surface. And we're going to have a look at the before and after. So this was the surface before. And now with the cracks and scratches applied, this is the surface after. And you can see like, just because I increased the normal a lot here, this is very prominent and very like soft carved. You could see like there's no scratch like someone went over there with a screwdriver or a razor blade, but actually kind of eroded, kind of soft carved into here. And this is so prominent even though I used a opacity factor of 0.03. So again, working with these flat surfaces asks you to be very confident and precise about how much values you're going to add or subtract. So next up, we are going to clamp some noise peaks as written here, which generally just really flat off cut some of the peaks we introduced here, because sometimes things jump out of the range and we actually want to have this a pretty flat surface, and this is already quite heavily noisy. Even though it's looking good, no question, it's quite noisy. So I'm using a clamp grayscale node, and you can see here I'm using a very precise value of 4.97, which is the exact value for me to work with. If I'm showing you this in the normal, you can see like here some areas are now like flat, like they're really chopped off. And going anything beyond that, even with very low values, already introduces a lot more of the area cutoff that I do not want in general. I just do not want them. Next up, we have like a soft polish, which is just a histogram range node, which I do not touch. I just want to like minimize the range, so this will be pushed down even more. As you can see here, it's like very clean now, very clean, very soft. But it's exactly what we are aiming for, because the actual surface should only be very, very softly attacked, while the main damage lies within the cavities we're going to be talking about soon. All right, so now there's our second detail pass. Now that we like brought these values all down together and like really squashed them, we can now start for the fine detailing. As you can see here, I'm calling them high frequency bumps. And all I did was using my custom grunge 3, which is a portal node that goes back to a noise I like did very far out of the whole material down here. It's a grunge dirt thin. We have used this before. It's one of these Adobe nodes that you might not have. I equalized it and did nothing else. So I did not adjust the node overall. I did not adjust equalize. I just wanted to have like some random really high frequency noise. So I portaled this over because I'm reusing this at some other areas as well. And I plugged it into a normal. Didn't touch the intensity because it's not needed here. Plug this in a curvature smooth node and use the curvature output of this. Plug this again in a levels node and push all the black values over to the white values. So we are cutting off lower ones and just keeping the high frequency noise. And this is going to be used within a multi-direction warp grayscale. The intensity is fairly high, even though we are only using 2 directions. But our input, like our intensity input, is our original base height, which is like there's not a lot of contrast going on. It's just basically pure gray. So the effect is not too strong. And you can see here, like all it did was basically make it a little bit smoother and looks like a chromatic aberration effect, basically. This is going to be blend over using a screen node because we want this bumps to be outwards. And I'm just also going to mask where this effect is applied. So I'm auto leveling my base range here, equalizing it to reintroduce more values that I can work with, and afterwards using a histogram select set to these values because I was just picking some areas that looked good to me and I wanted to exclude some that didn't. This mask just worked for me. So if we have a look at our result now, you can see that we added, let me go back and forth. We added like a layer now on top of this that looks kind of like scratches, but it's just like, it might just be dirt, for example, or paint drops or anything that has been dropped on the floor. Maybe even just spilled drinks that like cluttered together with dust and formed a little bit of speckle that's just outward on the surface. And again, you could see these are very, very tight changes, not something that you would particularly notice, but it just adds to the realism. If it's missing, it's missing. You would know. So there's another detail pass here, which again makes use of my custom grunge 3, which is the one at the very beginning of the graph here. Again, you could technically use whatever grunge you like. It's just about finding the right values that you're moving in. So as I added these values here, I just made sure to get some gray values that are very soft, kind of distorted, looked speckled in a sense, but I didn't pay too much attention on how they are actually applied or what's shown in there. It's just about the correct range and the correct size that you're going to add. So for the third detail pass, I wanted to have like more pronounced speckles that are applied on the surface. And you can see here in my final blend, there's another screen mode happening. So I used a fractal sum base set to these values, which just makes sure it's a very high frequency noise. And I used my custom grunge from before and actually just slope blurred this. And what this does is, yeah, it just distorts the whole fractal sum and makes it even more high frequency in parts. Because we have here like per pixel changes, which is really high frequency. But down here we have like bigger areas, which is cool. Basically exactly what we want, and you will see in a second why. Because we are now going to equalize this, which gives us like a huge range for all the noise here. And you can really see how non-uniform that is. It's a cheap way to increase a lot of high frequency details that are not uniformly applied everywhere. And in the next step, I'm going to use a levels node, again, crunching all the blacks over to the white values so we can eliminate most of the stuff. And as you can see here, we are left with basically, I think it's a dirt2 node. Yeah, you can see this is mine, this is the dirt2. They're technically the same from what we did, but mine is very high frequency and has like this few sparkle dots that are all like splattered in between here. And again, I'm using a mask because I don't want to have this applied anywhere. And to be like lazy, I just used the mask that I did before and plugged it into another histogram select with different values, which gave me the opportunity to mask out areas that I used before and pronounce others. Adding this, again, doesn't give you anything to look at. So we're going to move our preview nodes over here. And as you can see here, these small high frequency speckles and dust drops were introduced before and after. Again, from far away, not even noticeable, but this is not our aim. Our aim is to be photorealistic and to mimic how it's looking in the real world. All right, and now we come to the fun part, the broken concrete blend. And to make sense out of this node, which introduces the first values that are not just pure gray, we have to move back into our graph to a completely different point, which is here. Let me just grab my preview nodes and bring them over. So what we did here is actually just defining a mask to break our concrete apart, but we also need to make sure that the breaking apart is not too sharp, but also not too soft in a sense. It's complicated for concrete in a sense because depending on what impacts the concrete and how long it's exposed to natural erosion after that, some details can look very sharp and very dusty and like very shattered, while others can look smooth a lot. If someone walked over that area multiple times, it just smooths out. So to make sure it looks realistic, we need to incorporate every little bit of possible erosion and damage that happens to these cracks. But to kick this off, I'm using a Grunge Map 4. I'm using this particularly because it already gives me some kind of blobs with different height variation inside them. Let me just check how it looks as default. Yeah, so this is a very good start. And all I did was alter this node. So I'm going to pick this little helper here, which lists everything I did. I inverted it and changed the balance. Okay, it didn't do much to this node, not so much what I expected. But yeah, in the next step, as you can see, I increased the scale and rotated it a bit because I want to have these spots to be bigger in size. This is aimed to be a 2x2 meter area. So I need to make sure that all the
damages that I apply here and also the details that apply to the dips are in the correct scale. And these were just too small to start with. So I increased the size, broke the tiling by doing this, as you can see here. Pressing the spacebar shows you the tiling. So I need to make sure it tiles back again by using a make it tile photo grayscale. And honestly, this would probably become an issue if you're going to use this in an environment, as this damage is just very repetitive. But for the sake of presentation or isolated renders, this is fine. So I didn't bother too much because this mask can essentially be driven by anything you want. If you want, you can paint your own mask in a different software and just import it here. So all I went for was the visuals at this point. And you're going to see that I'm mixing this still up a lot. So next up, I'm going to use a levels node. I inverted this through the levels, so switching the black and the white inputs here. So I adjusted the levels just to isolate those areas, but make sure that there's still some soft gradient happening towards the edges, because this is what we are aiming for. The dips themselves should be clearly masked, but the borders should be both smooth and also sharp and very chunky. So next up, I blurred all this, which totally makes sense after what I just said. But it's important to have a clear distinction on where the mask is happening, because right now with the levels, we have a lot of spots in here that we do not particularly want. And by blurring this and using a levels node after, you can see like we're eliminating most of this and getting like clear areas for our damage, which is also now not looking that uniform as before. But we still need to break a lot of uniformity. So the first step is to directional warp these. And I'm just using any settings here, any settings. I didn't pay too much attention. I just played with them around until I was satisfied and used a Clouds 2 node here as an input. Right. Next, I'm using a slope blur grayscale HD with very low values, but set to max. And what that does is, if you zoom in, you can see like all my edges are like pushed outwards a bit. And this is important because our mask is going to be subtracted from our actual height map. So any values that are less white at the border will get affected less in the subtraction, which essentially means that we get a fall off, like a smooth fall off for our mask. And for this, I'm using a Clouds 2 with a higher scale just to make sure like the details of the slope are in the correct scale. And next up, I'm using a non-uniform blurless grayscale with both inputs from my initial input, which basically just makes it all a blob. So if you're using a non-uniform blur with both inputs here, like the input and the blur maps set to the same, it just blobs every shape that you're putting into this. And this is very good for us because we need to further layer our details once again. So as you can see, I'm slope blurring to get in some chunks, non-uniform blur to make it blobby, and then another slope blur to again add some chunks outward. So we're really layering and slowly pushing this like a massage to the areas on the outer bounds here. For this slope, however, I'm using not a clouds, but this noise, which again is a grunge dirt, this custom node from Adobe. I transformed it. I think I rotated it. I made it a bit bigger. Use a make a tile photo grayscale to reintroduce a tiling factor, and then slightly blurred it, like really slightly blurred it. I think this is the same setup that I use, the same setup that I used down here. All right. So we're slope blurring this, pushing all the bounds outwards. And again, using a non-uniform blur grayscale node, but this time only affecting certain areas. And this mask is again purely random. I just leveled my input that I had here because it was already there. So I recycled it. just crunch these values together to get a binary mask. Blur it again, so we have like a little bit softer values, and use this as a blur map. And I always increase the samples, but this time I set the blades to 3 and not 9 as usual, because I wanted to have this blur a less precise effect. It should be a limbo between actually blurring something and still revealing the shape that was originally there. So the more blades you decrease, the more obvious this like non-uniform direction is to spot. So by increasing these blades, we kind of obscure the actual direction. And for the last step, I still use another slope blur, and this time using a Voronoi fractal, which let's see what I changed here at this node. I just changed the scale. So nothing too fancy. I just changed the scale to have the correct scaling distribution for outer skirts here. And again, using a slope blur grayscale HD because I want the crispiness. Using a regular slope blur would not give me the same results. It's just not doable. Let's see, it's set to max and a low intensity. Let's just try to mimic this. What do I have here? I have like 0.8. All right. As you can see, with the regular slope blur, it looks like this. And with the HD, I still maintain like some blurriness and some chunks on the outer parts that I want to have, while it's not happening here, but it's happening here. This is why I'm using the HD mostly over the regular one. All right, and this masks our broken concrete mask. So this is literally the mask we're using to subtract from other areas where we didn't want to have certain details. But also make sure where we want to have our details for the dip itself. All right, so now let's go to the detail that we want to put into our broken concrete mask. Let me just quickly highlight this here with our preview node. Yeah, so it doesn't look too appealing, and I might need to introduce this as height, but it wouldn't work because we're working with wrong values. So let me just invert this real quick. Okay, so we can see this would be our chunk, our damage, if we were to apply it like this. But we want to move further because we want to have a more sloped gradient. We're also having details in here and details on the slopes. And for that, let me just quickly preview our final material again. Might take a second to compute. All right. Let's see. Let's go to this one here. It's easier to spot here. So moving back here, we are now introducing like the noise in between the dip here. And for that, I use another S splitter, which just recycles my mask that I created before. Again, nothing particular that I thought about this, just making sure that the noise that I use here has some details that are in the correct scale, at least in my opinion, at this time, at this point of time where I use this mask to move on. And I'm splattering it all over just to, like, just a few repeats, scale variation and such. Again, this is just a regular tile sampler, so nothing too fancy. I'm auto leveling it, so we get back to the whole range. And in the next step, I'm low passing it. Again, this is the custom node from Daniel Tiger. You could also just use a histogram range node. It would probably yield the same results, but I felt like this has some more control and is some finer low passing that I actually search for. This is all blended together, set to multiply with a clouds node. that I auto leveled because the default clouds node don't have the full range. And this gives me just some height variation in like my whole mess here. And as you can see, again, we have like the portal for the broken concrete mask and another portal already here. Like I could just move the wire over here, but I felt like let's keep it straight throughout the whole material. So what I did here is using a blend node set to multiply and my broken concrete mask as a base. And whatever I did here, like all this noise, just multiplied in there. Just give a base distortion and noise to work with. And now we need to further modify this to get the result that we want. So let me preview this again here, just so you can see it. You can see this is like a very distorted high frequency and macro noise. Like it's just too much of everything at this point of time. Right, and we need to further modify this. So what I did was taking my low pass filter here, my result. I could just use the auto levels as well, but I used the low pass here. Put it into a transform node and increase the scale and rotated it. Make sure I apply the tiling back with the make a tile photo grayscale. Level the node so I can isolate some areas. Again, I switched these values around here to invert the input. Blurred them a bit and blended them over with a substract. Also, what I did before was use a regular Perlin noise, nothing fancy. Also leveled it and also blend them over with the substract. So we are moving away noise that we introduced before. As you can see here, this was our base. This was our starting point. Like it's very uniform. Now we're chopping away some of these details. Also something that lies inside the mask already. So we chop down details here, and now we chop down even more details. And we are getting like smaller and smaller in a sense. So next up, we got a non-uniform blur grayscale again, because I want some of these details to be once vanished and be like very soft here. And you could see it in the final material. What we do here, like this directional fade, just helps us creating this transition from the regular concrete over to the broken concrete. Like imagine this one has not received the same impact as this sharp edge, for example, but it's still damaged. It's still part of the same cavity because water flows down here and slowly carves away more and more of the concrete without actually having something that impacted it. As mask for this, I use another leveled version of my base mask back here. So again, you can see I'm recycling just some nodes that work for me. I leveled it to have a like tighter mask and use it as a non-uniform blur. Right. So next up, I'm using a fractal sum 4. Didn't even change it. Just a transform to D again, increased the size, broke the tiling, brought the tiling back in, warped it just ever so slightly. This time again with my base mask. it's just recycling. It's just recycling with the same stuff over and over. It also helps adding these layers because you introduce new details that are based on some details you already used before. So by doing this with a non-directional warp just on the x-axis, and yeah, I don't know if I even changed the value here. I just made sure that I get this like ink splatter effect because this is very good as surface detailing. So what I did after my non-uniform blur, I blended this detail over with add sub. So we introduce more heights on the heights and more lows on the lows, basically increasing the contrast. And I also used a mask for this. I think just to make sure that this is right. Since we're using add sub without using a mask, let me quickly show you. This would also it would add only dark areas, which we obviously do not want because we're only working with our cracked mask here. So I need to mask this effect to the actual cracks, which is why I'm using this here. And it's just my input from before with the levels node. It's not even binary, so I'm not paying too much attention to be precise here, just to localize the effect where I need to be. Next up is a blend node, again set to add sub because we want to add more contrast. And I'm just using a Warner fractal node, and I think I didn't even change this at all. I think I didn't even touch any of the sliders, just add sub blending them in. Next up, we are blurring again. And I told you I'm adding layers, so we have this blur here. Or better said, we had noise before, we added blur. Now we add noise before, now we add another blur. And as you can see, this is now applying to some new areas, but partially also on areas that are already blurred. I didn't pay attention to avoid using the same areas again, but I just used a regular black and white spots node here, black and white spots 1, leveled it and used it as blur whip. I didn't depict too much consideration into this. I just went for something that felt good. Now we are slope blurring this just ever so slightly, as you can see, ever so slightly. It might even be too much now that I look at it, but I want to have more crystalline effects here. Actually, I think it's probably too much. I would end up being better with adding another blend node. And let me just really recycle this node again. Take it from here. And just recycling it again and subtracting. So we have a more localized Voronoi fractal noise here. Using this as an input. And let's see what the difference is. Yeah, so now we have like very distinct cracking, while other parts that were blurry are still remain blurry. And I think this is even giving a better result. So I'm just going to stick with it. Right, and for the last bit, I'm just copying it over this result over my initial blurred result by just a random mask. I don't think it's particularly needed, but for some reason I did it back then, and it surely had its reason. But all you need to remind yourself of is that we want to have a mask that incorporates every detail that could possibly be introduced over the time when it comes to destruction. We want to have impact, we want to have erosion, we want to have dust like damage, we want to have height variation, and all that happened here is introducing all these details slowly but surely. And this leaves us with our portal node for the broken concrete height, which again is referenced back down here in our blend node. And all I did was just subtract it. Nothing too fancy, I just subtracted it. And let me take over our nodes. Oops. Back here to visualize this. Let's just preview this again. Right, this was our height and normal before, and now that we introduced the depths, we are ending up with something like this, which is looking fairly good. Probably even the surface is still too noisy, in my opinion. So I would go back to the histochrome range here and decrease the range even more, like 0.25 probably. Yeah, this is giving me a better look overall for the surface. All right. So now that we introduced this, it's good, it's cool, but we want to have even more height variation. We want to incorporate this material really, or this detail really, into what we did already. So what I did here was take a run my fractal node and let's see what I changed here. Here, a lot of things happen probably. I adjust the scale, the distortion intensity, roughness, linearity, rounded curve, and so on and so forth. Generally, you can experiment with this. It's very important to really copy all these values. But I want to have like a distinct height variation that I didn't introduce before. And this is going to be overlaid on top of my initial mask. But I'm using the same height map that I introduced before as a mask for this. And what this gives us is a ever so slight height variation, which increases the contrast and also makes some things a little bit more blurry. Let me just quickly cut the height because this is distracting me a bit. As you can see, this looks quite uniform, I think, in a sense. It's hard to spot maybe. But now we get really localized areas and clusters. So these are very high in slope and kind of soft, while the rest is really chunky. But of course, this isn't enough. We got two more passes, which I will briefly go over. So I'm using a moisture noise, didn't change any values. Used both inputs into a slow blur grayscale HD to introduce like this crystalline effect. And now blurring this effect by my initial moisture noise. And this is going to be blend over again, this time using a subtract and a leveled version of my broken concrete height. So this time I'm made sure that this effect is only applied to certain areas or more to certain areas. And what that gives is another breakup in the areas here. Like it's flattening this a bit and like distorting a bit. We could also just run with this. I think from a visual appeal, at least what the normal says, this is also really cool. But this made sure that the dance really looked like dance. It just increased the overall height variation. And for the last bit, I wanted to add more pebbles, so small chunks of debris that are left over or get carved out. And for this, I used a Dirt 2 node, didn't adjust it. Took the S better or a tile sampler and just repeated the shape over and over. And blended this with the max lighten because I want to add detail back on top of all we did so far. And also using the same mask, so it's only applied at that specific areas. And what that does is give me some pebbles here, as you can see. All right, so as you can see here, I'm just going to remove this now and preview my material again. Let me zoom out a bit. As you can see here, this portal is called Final Height, and there are a lot of cables going out from it. So yes, this is technically my final height. You will see back here in my final adjustments, there is an input portal that also says final height. And I'm adjusting the height again a bit. But it's just about giving it the right range by bringing back all the values, putting it in the correct range. As you can see here, I'm like limiting this to a very low range and also slightly blurring it. This is important for the height maps because I want to avoid some artifacts that are still apparent here, just because we use some really hard cuts. But yeah, just for the sake of logic, I call the final height because no more adjustments or additions have been made after this final part. All right, so what I'm doing, however, is altering the normal map a bit more because the normal map can be driven separately from your height map. And in some occasions, this should even be done, preferably in materials where the height map needs to use very, very low values in order to function correctly. So as you can see here, I get the final height portal into a bent normal map. I wanted to use the bent normal here because the introduction or the the respect for the AO in this material helps to just sharpen the dents and give them the pronunciation that I want to see in the material. A regular normal or normal Sobel would also work, but I just use the bent normal to get used to it more. But what I did back here, you can see, is use two normal combine nodes. And the stuff I added is, for one, an adjustment of my final height. So I'm using this final height output that I did before, histogram selecting a earlier portion, like lower values and a small range, just to isolate some areas and basically get access to the edges and the slopes in particular. I'm blurring these, so there's more pronunciation towards the edges and the outer parts that grow into the main material. And this is non-uniform directional warp. Again, I'm using this effect often and trying to introduce this splatter effect. And all this does is basically adding some more, you could say, chipping or adding pebbles towards just the outer areas, like just the slope that comes from the concrete into the cavity. As input, I'm using the S splatter here, which probably just takes, again, my dirt 2 node back there to introduce some very high frequency. Afterwards, this is leveled and made sure that I get the full range for all the outer edges. And this is blended on top using a multiply over what I did down here, which is just increasing the scale of the S-splatter by a lot. You can see there's a lot of repetition happening here, a lot of tiling, which will be not noticeable, which is why I went through it. And using the same setup with both inputs set to a slope blur to introduce this crystalline effect. And what this gives is basically this result, which doesn't look like much, but it will add a lot to the material soon. Lastly, I'm adjusting the range to make sure, this step is really important if you're working with normal details, because I only want to combine normal information that I actually touched. So if I were to use this as a normal information, all black areas would be interpreted as below our base height, because the value is 0 here and not 0.5. So I have to go back with the histogram range now to introduce a value of 0.5 or 0.25 to make sure that not a lot of our base height is affected. So this is put into a normal Sobel. You can see very, very soft detail. And this is used, this is combined with our base normal using the channel mixer technique. And if you go back to our regular normal, which was this, and combined with our crystalline effect we added here, you can see it's really incorporating this dip overall into the material, which we didn't have before. There's a step in between here, which kind of does the same. It's using some iteration of my color pass, just putting this into a grayscale conversion node, so I have a new noise to work with. I'm inverting it because the details just look better like this, and also using a normal Sobel with very low intensity, which I need to really zoom in so you can see it, just introduces some noise. And this is laid over. You can see this is my base normal down here, and this is the improved one with the noise. So even though my height map didn't have this, and I also don't want to have it in the height map because of the displacement, I can add noise later back on into the material by just using normal combine passes. We will talk about this in a second when we go over the color, but just to make sure why for the normal there's happening more even after my height map is finished. All right. So let's get to the color. You can see here I have a base color mask, which is probably a bit confusing in terms of naming, because it's not about the base color, but it's my base mask. And you can see here, it's just an alternate version of my final height. And I need this because I need to separate several colors from the cavities and the actual concrete. Right, so starting off with the different passes, it's basically always the same methods I use. So I'm going to jump over these more quickly than I did with the rest. I'm using the Ben Wilson color variation nodes. Again, this will be a ghost instance in your graph. I can only recommend using this color variation node from Ben Wilson because it's probably the most effective and powerful color node you will ever get your hands on. And I use it in literally every graph. So what I'm doing is I'm picking a uniform color, putting it in the output size here to absolute, and reducing the width and height to 16 by 16 pixel because it's the most performant way to treat colors. And since I'm using a lot of passes, I want to make sure that this is performant. So I'm plugging this into the color input of the color variation node, and I'm using like the grunge rust fine grunge as a driver for this, which again, I didn't choose it particularly because it's the grunge rust fine. I just chose it because the details were kind of random here. So I felt like they have a good starting point for me. I plugged this in the value variation inputs and just played with the value variation and the samples. You could see here if I change this, it's changing the effect of the color node here. So all I wanted to have is like a base variation with some different color tones of my base color here. This is going to be blended with another pass that basically does the same. So you can see here, I have the portraits of my base color mask as a driver and the uniform color and the gradient map. Here I sampled just a few brownish colors, and here I sampled another brownish gray color that I liked. And I'm blending both of these together with a blend node set to copy and 0.5 in the mix. And this is going to be blended with my initial base color here using my base color mask. So to separate the cavities from the actual concrete. And this is what I would call the base layer. So this is like the natural base color setup from the colors that I want to block in for this material. Everything that now comes will be added on top of this. So for the first color variation pass, I'm going to use a grayscale conversion node of my initial variation here because this gives me a really, really cool new map to drive information from. So I'm auto leveling this to increase the range and using a non-uniform directional warp with, I think, the grunge rust fine as an intensity map and a blurred version of this as the warp angle, which gives me this, you could say, directional flow that's happening here. These details are really flowing along the details I placed here. And I'm repeating this over just so to offset the shapes a little bit to the right and the left. And afterwards, just invert these values because I felt like they were fitting better. I'm also going to use a gradient node here after this to colorize my whole gradient and just sampling again some brownish gray red values, which are then going to be blend on top here using the same input that I drove the gradient from as a mask, which enables me to like introduce this color in respect to what I drove it from.
Okay, so moving on, we come to the second color variation pass. And while I'm looking at this, I think it would be beneficial to just show like the steps that I made throughout the color. I mean, you can see it here in the preview. But applied to the material, they definitely look different. So I'm going to pick a different HDRI, make this a little bit bigger here so we can see something. And also I'm going to grab my color output here. And where did we stop? We stopped here and connect it. This might take a while. We're on 4K again because I just reload the graph, but it's working fine. So as you can see, this is my current color setup, and it's very different from what we have in the end here. But again, my main goal was to get a decent feel of the colors that I want to have in there already, and also introduce a lot of variation, which we did already. So we can always change the colors later or darken them. When working with gradients, this is a little bit more tricky, as you would have to adjust these colors here, which is why I usually restrain from using gradients over regular colors. But I felt like if I go in here, if I use this with my color variation node, I wouldn't get the exact same results that I was looking for here. So it was really important to me that I have a gradient fall off from the direction I was going to. So there might be other workflows, but the gradient was just the cheapest one, and I knew I would change the color overall later on anyway. So I didn't bother too much, but just to get in the range of colors that I need in the first place. Okay, but moving on. You come to the second color variation. Again, I always have a blend node at the end. Also, I didn't talk about the blends too much, I think. Yeah, I mainly used copy. I tend to use copy all the way through because I'm working with masks. Also, color just behaves differently with the blending modes. But there are a few that you can use with color, which one of those is soft light, for example. I think we have a different video or tutorial covering about the blend modes, but in general, soft light is kind of brightening up certain spots. It's hard to explain. I could have also just used copy, but I felt like soft light is giving me what I was searching for here. So again, we're in the second color variation pass. So all we want to do is, if you look at the before and after, wait a second, is to block in more color variation, which should layer on top of other colors, but also fill in the spots that we yet didn't touch. Which is what I'm aiming for, because as this concrete is dirty, I want to have very few spots that are actually the real concrete color as it was when it started out the material, or when it was applied to the floor, or when the concrete was poured and it hardened, then it has this grayish color, and I want to get rid of this altogether, because as it's dirty, and as you know how concrete that it's heavily used is treated, it just gets dirty all over, and all the dirt gets slammed into the ground, and it's really hard to get rid of and change its color there. Which is why we want to have a lot of variation. And for this, I'm using another mask, which just was the Grunge map 9 here. I think I didn't change any settings, no. I vector warped it. And as vector, I used my normal map, which I generated here beforehand. So the reason why I'm doing this is because the vector warp really distorts the color on the outer shapes here. It's not affecting anything at all, because my regular normal is quite low in intensity and in detail. But the dips we have here, those distort our Grunge map. But they mainly distort them on the outer skirts here. This is where we get all these swirl effects. And this is good because I want to have some variation on the on the border where both materials meet, so they fuse together visually. And at the next step, I use a non-uniform directional warp with a Grunge galvanic noise. Again, I'm not really changing these noises overall, because all I want to do is distort and create variation. And what you can see here is that, let me get down here. We have, this is really depicting the border, which would probably look a little bit artificial. This is why I'm displacing this and kind of offsetting the values, and have a directionality of how the dirt was applied to the floor. Using this as a mask also doesn't show too much of the difference. So as you can see here, it's just another layer that kind of works off from our actual normal and height shape below, which is what we want. So let me just preview this for a second. I think I should just be able to grab this and put it here. Yes. So you can see we're getting brighter overall, but we just get a really non-uniform color variation that, even though it's like random, it kind of follows the damage we have on the ground here. All right, so now we come to a highlight pass, and it might be misleading due to the title because we're not really picking up highlights or like convex curvature, but we're adding like brighter spots, which I just called highlights here. I could also just say like bright spot pass. And yeah, all it does is, again, using a mask that I'm creating down here. So I'm using my custom grunge down below the portal. If you remember, it's like somewhere down here. Let me see where it was. Here. This is my custom grunge. So I'm using this as an input. Let's get back up here. I'm leveling it just to get like spots out of it and a lot of areas that I do not want to fill with color. And next up, I'm using my concrete mask to subtract the spots from there because I don't want to have this detail anywhere in my dips. It's just to be out there on the concrete itself. Again, my blend is set to a copy here with a low opacity just to control the intensity of the effect overall. And again, for the color variation node, I'm just plugging in the color that I want with some mask to drive details from. And yeah, just experiment with these settings until you get something that satisfies your needs. And this leaves us with some brighter spots that conform like the outer edges of our dips, which is important. So previewing this takes a second, and yeah, there you can see like ever so slightly another layer of dirt, which is also why we are using not the full opacity range here of our blend, because we want to have some details from below still appearing in there to mimic this feel of layering details over each other. In the next section, we have a dark value pass. So I like to work from a logic perspective. I got all my base values, then I got my variation of the base values, and now I'm starting to add details, which you can see here after the detail passes. Oops, I didn't want to grab that note. After the detail passes here, I'm having a third color variation pass just to explain again the layering effect that I want to create. This could have been moved before here, but then if my highlight and my dark value passes weren't that good, they just don't look very well embed, which is what I want to avoid at any possible given time because it just feels artificial if it's not incorporated well into the rest of the material. So for the dark value pass, I'm using a grayscale conversion of my current color and auto leveling it, which will give me an input mask that is already very interesting and very noisy, but also respects all the changes we have made before. And this will be my drivers for the next color variation node. So it's sampling along all the values that I have already put in here, which is really cool and just helps to sell the realism. Right, and for my mask, I'm using a workflow. I do not know where I learned this from. I really can't remember. If I find out, I'm going to give kudos in the README as well, of course. But I'm using my custom grunge 2, which is like I showed you before down there for another detail pass. I'm leveling it to get another set of spots, basically. And then I'm using a normal to height node, which shows this red marker here, obviously telling me that it's not the correct input. But for some reason, this node still accepts a grayscale value and gives a really cool like shadowing effect. I don't know why this is working actually, but it's giving a really cool effect that I'm looking for. And I'm leveling this again, which you can see is like highlighting little dots here. Like it's it's like a directional light that's shining on the surface or on the height that I drew from my mask here. You could use anything else here. I just went with this to try out if it works, and it worked out. And at the next step, I'm warping these spots again because they were too heavy overall. Like they look a little bit cloudy, and I thought they were like too intense in the detail that I want to put in. So I have to distort it. Again, using any grunge map, you could also recycle maps. I just wanted to try out what it's looking, and I felt it was all right because it gives this kind of offset feel and also introduces these kind of man-made stripes already, which I felt like were a really good touch. And again, using this as mask on a blend node with an opacity value that's set around the middle, maybe a little bit higher. And looking before and after, you see it's ever so slightly adding like dark stain touches. Let's look at it in a material. Yeah, as you can see here, going too strong with these values, I will increase them now, kind of looked already artificial to me. I don't know why exactly, but I felt this dirt here is missing a lot of depth. So giving it a too strong value in the material didn't work out too well for me. I just wanted to have a broader range of values overall. And this just looked like it was darkened. Like anything that was below here is darkened. And it also, by accident, reintroduces some of the original concrete color that might have been apparent here. So it was a really cool touch, and I just went with it. So for the third color variation pass, let me just check. Yeah, all right. For the third color variation pass, I wanted to already include some details into the cavities, even though there is a separate color pass that will like give the real color that I want to have in the cavities or in the dips here. I went for another color variation pass to make sure there is already happening a little bit inside here and not as a post-processing effect. So all I did was drive another gradient, this time sampling way too much colors, but I felt like the color variation that I get from this is actually pretty cool, so it didn't bother too much. And I got the mask by driving another normal to height HQ from my grunge map, because I like this like really directional curved stripes here. I multiplied my base mask over it because I only want to have it at these spots, and I leveled them to mask out the effect a little bit more. Right, and like the before and after is barely noticeable, and you could probably avoid using this step overall because in the end, if I look at it, it's taking a step back in terms of color variation because it just brightens up these layers. But I mean, one layer or one layer less didn't make that much of a difference. And since we're going for realism and quality, I just felt like keep it in here, keep it in. All right, now I'm going to come to a pass that is crucial for most materials if you really want to add realism and also help your render later on. And this is something that I call a noise pass. And the idea is to use all the colors you had before, make changes on them on a per pixel basis or close to per pixel basis, and just reapply those colors over your original. And all this does is gives you a feel of scanned color data. I'm going to show you how that works. So let's zoom in a little bit closer. As you can see, we have a lot of color variation going on here already, which is great. Like I'm really happy with the result already. And it's also a lot of per pixel based changes. But what you can see is there is a lot of like same tones happening all around here, which is fine, which is like this example is probably even kind of bad already because the color turned out to be really good. But what I did here is take a fractal sum base with a really high roughness and a max level, like it's really, really noisy, but still a bit blurry. I'm auto leveling it to get more range. And this will be my driver for a color variation node, which I drove derive my colors from my previous color result from. So this is my input here. I'm increasing the samples to full range and also a lot of value variation and a lot of hue variation. And all this does gives me like a really uniform color noise, but it samples only the colors that were already present in the material anyway. And I'm reapplying this with a very low opacity value and a copy blend node, and also the noise mask that I used before to drive the values. And what this does is only applying the colors that it sampled from the lighter values. And it generally, you can see when I zoom in, all it does is give a noise layer on top of everything that we had so far and create some depth to it. Again, it might not be needed in some points and also create like a really noisy effect sometimes that you do not want. But if I zoom out, there's a lot of, like, for example, here, there's a lot of unified color, which is too uniform for me. It's irrational to think that in the real world, color values, even though they look uniform, are actually uniform in any detail you see. And adding this layer just gives more noise to it ever so slightly in the same range of colors that were already there. Let's see if it makes a change visually. So first of all, I need to go into my third color pass, which didn't change anything visually actually. But now going into the noise pass, let's see. Oh, I cannot do this because I would be rerouting. So let's move manually. Yeah, what you saw here was like everything kind of got flatter in a sense. The colors just got more flat because we artificially decreased the contrast by adding more noise. But this is actually what sells realism, because really high contrasts might appear in the real world, but they are usually either man-made or maybe introduced because of strong lights, shadows, or like really strong details. Like we still have these spots here that are giving a strong detail, but in general, the colors are way more spread out, and this just unifies everything. So next up, I have a color adjustment, which is just a a contrast luminosity node set to these settings here. And all I wanted to do is like get all the colors that I have now in the correct range and contrast that I'm looking for. Again, I could have done this like previously already by readjusting all gradients and all colors, but this is just hard to control. You know, like I could make a change here, resample this gradient and get a completely different result that I'm not looking for because I had all the colors in place as I wanted them. And by adjusting this afterwards with the correct range and correct samples where I want them, it's just easier and more convenient. It's also more robust because I could now work from here adding more details without ever fearing that if I want to change colors, it's like blowing everything up. So this puts everything in the more or less correct range of what I want to have in the material later on. So now I come to, let's say, the post-processing pass. Usually this pass or these passes would be the last one in the color. But since I have to apply extra color to my dips here that have different, like, let's say, dirt or ambient occlusion properties than the rest of the material, I need to make this pass before I add the colors into these areas. And to do that, so my general setup for a dirt pass is just use a dirt mask node, which wants to have an ambient occlusion and a curvature. So I didn't bother too much what to input. I just took my final normal and a curvature Sobel node and also my final height and made an ambient occlusion based on horizon, like HBAO means horizon-based AO filter. I could use the ray traced one, but the HBAO is less precise and gives more blurry results, which was actually what I'm looking for here for my dirt. So I used this node. And for the dirt pass, just generally, I'm resampling what I had here already by grayscale conversion, auto-leveling it, put it into my color variation node with very high samples and my dirt color of choice, and just blending it by copy. And as you can see, it's just pronouncing the edges around here, because the whole surface is already dirty on how we applied color, and it's also flat, so there's very little for the dirt mask to pick from, because we have very, very low height values. But the dips, those are present immediately in the HBO, as you can see, and also the curvature. So we're just going to apply dirt just around the edges here, and also just where sharp edges appear. Let's have a look at this. Yeah, you can see like they're just more pronounced now. And actually, it's a little bit off of realism, but I felt like if the sun is like directly shining onto this area here, it's a little bit too shallow, too flat in the lighting overall, which is why I just increased the contrast here a bit. All right, next up we got a sharpen filter, which more or less does the same as the noise pass, but it just pronounces per pixel details. So all I did here was take my final height, make a high pass grayscale, which is like the common workflow for sharpening. I auto leveled it so I get more range, inverted it after, and I will show you in a second why that works really good. Put it through a gradient node because we need color values, and then just apply it on top, set to overlay. And what this does is now not highlighting like the most outer edges, like the areas where the concrete is cut in, but just slightly below it. So let's have a look at this again. We have our curvature values here on the, like, you could say right in front of the cut, but not directly on the cut, which is not correctly the area I want to highlight. But inverting it just offsets these values and puts them like right on the edge here, a little bit downwards, but since the displacement is chipping away this nonetheless, we just get color values that are, or sharpening values that are highlighting right where the displacement kicks in. And we need to really zoom in to even see a difference, but this is our edge before, kind of soft, and this is our edge after, and now it's really embedded into the rest of the material. It's still there visually because we got the normal information and the height, but the color now respects more the correct placement of the colors in the material rather than just driving from the edge here, which would look too strong in the end. So previewing this will probably not change too much visually. You could just see like they got bumped up. I'm going to go back and forth. So this was before, and actually it's like respecting the edge. But now through this method, we get a more pronounced and realistic bump. Like it's tightening the values towards the edge here. Right, so next up we have another highlight damage pass. And let me just quickly have a look here. Right, so when I remember correctly, we got these scratches and cracks mask, as you remember. And I want to like give them a little bit more pronunciation in the material. So I'm leveling these by inverting the values and tighten them. And afterwards use a max light and blend node with my previous mask set as the foreground and my inverted mask set as the background. And what this does is like filling the crack gaps. So we get a, you could say like a hard, like an artificial edge detect at this point here. I'm using another levels node to like get the edge isolated, but also have a little bit more gradient towards the center pieces here. And again, I'm using my broken concrete mask, as you can see here, to subtract these details from my dips, because the normal information that we're driving this from is not apparent here. So we need to mask this out in order to avoid having values in here. For the color, again, nothing special. Another color variation node with my color of choice, something brighter. And I'm blending this using a copy node with a fairly high opacity value this time. But I think it was necessary, so it's actually visible. So let's just preview this for a second. And as you can see, barely any change, but if you zoom in, you can see like changes. Right, we have like a uniform noise area here, and by adding the highlights, we introduce some artificial broad colors back in here, which again just unifies the whole material as a whole. We wouldn't need to have so many color passes, but experience just shows that most of the material actually sells through the color, because we are best at like